My name is Deacon Darrell Branch. I'm the deacon here at St. Gabriel's. On behalf of our parish, I welcome you here tonight. And I'd like to welcome our panel members. We have Father John Floater. He's priest, professor at St. Paul's Seminarian, and chair of the Archbishop Bioethic Commission. He will be speaking about Catholic teaching regarding what is acceptable for Catholics and what is not, and why, and when couples are trying to conceive. Then we have Chris Henley from Catholic Charities. She will be speaking about adoption. We got Dr. April Lynn, specialized in internal medicine and pediatrics. She'll be speaking about natural family planning. I'm gonna mess your name up. And we have Joseph Pribble. He's Catholic marriage and family therapist at
Lovatis Therapy Center.
And he'll be speaking about how men handle struggles versus women. And then Chris, my wife Chris, and I will be speaking a little bit about our journey and about our support group that we lead. And then we have Susan and Jeff, and they'll be speaking about their personal experience with infertility. And also, you notice we have a videotape. Just the panel members are going to be videotaped. At the end, when we have questions, it'll be shut off, so you don't have to worry about questions being taped or anything like that. And also at the end, we're going to have refreshments. And you also have an opportunity to talk to any one of the panel members one-on-one if you choose to do so. And I'd like to thank our pro-life group here at St. Gabriel and the Office of Family and Marriage for sponsoring our group tonight. They basically pulled everything together. So thank you. I'd like to share with you a prayer that my wife Chris started saying in the beginning of the struggle. She said it kind of helped her to come to grasp with what God wanted for us in her life. And I'm sure you guys are going to recognize the prayer. Let's begin. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, accepting hardships as a pathway to peace, talking as he did, the sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen. In the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
15 minutes?
A little longer. We won't pull the mic from you.
Okay.
At least around 15.
Okay. Great. Well, welcome to all of you. This is my first time speaking in front of a group like this, but I'm not a stranger to speaking. I've been a priest now for 7 years. I was served at St. Stephen's in Anoka, which is a giant mega parish up there, and I was one of 3 priests, and we served we served Mercy Hospital, a number of nursing homes, the county jail, and the state mental hospital. So, I would give interactive homilies whether I wanted them or not, And so that was my big parish ministry experience. And then the Archbishop sent me off to school. And I went and studied at the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family Studies in Washington, D.C. And studied there. Now I've returned and I'm in my 3rd year teaching at the St. Paul Seminary, which is the graduate level seminary for men immediately preparing for priesthood. So it's master's level type work. And I teach specifically sexual morality, so all about, I teach it tomorrow, so I get to talk for 3 hours straight about sex with a bunch of guys preparing to be priests. It's awesome. It's awesome. We're reading Carol Wojtyła, John Paul II tomorrow for class. So, and then I teach bioethics with my friend Deacon Steve Najarian, who's a retired surgeon, thoracic surgeon. So he helps me with the science, and I help him with the theology, and we teach that together. And so it's based upon my parish experience, my experience as a professor, thinking and reading and teaching about these subjects, as well as my own lived experience in my family that I'm speaking to you here tonight, this evening. I do not know what it's like to be married. I do not know what it's like to have kids, and I don't know what it's like to perhaps struggle with fertility and struggle with the possibility and future of having children. I know, though, for many, in my experience working with them in the parish, that it's a real great desire and a real great struggle and a real suffering oftentimes, with many questions, with many doubts, and many people proposing solutions that are at the very least complicated, but sometimes daunting and even a bit scary. But I am blessed. I'm the baby of 7 children in my family, and I have 26 nieces and nephews, so I've learned a little bit about what it is to have kids around. But I'm number 7. My number 1 brother, so the eldest, is unable to have children biologically. Because of an illness he had as a young man, it wreaked some havoc on his reproductive organs there, and so he is unable to have children. And he, I think, wanted to, of course, get married and start having a big family. You know, I have 26 nieces and nephews. You know, we're fruitful and we're trying to multiply, right? And he sees his younger brother Steve, who has 10 kids. My brother Steve has 10 kids, and he got married, and it wasn't for 10 years until he had his first kid, and that only by adoption. So he struggled greatly with fertility. He went through the struggle of going to see doctors, professionals, and I know it was a great hardship for both him and his wife. But as I say, after 10 years, he was open to adoption, and he was blessed to receive a wonderful child who is now in college studying over at University of Wisconsin River Falls. And he was blessed to be able to receive 2 more children. It's kind of funny, they don't look like us, but they're real part of the family. His youngest son, Max, his mother was African American, and so Max is a very large, darker skinned fellow, and in my family that's not quite how we all look. But it was a great, great gift. And so as I speak, and perhaps have some challenging words, know that I have been with my brother in his struggles, and I've seen what can happen when one is open to the new possibilities and the new gifts that the Lord might be calling us to be able to receive. Now, in general, it's difficult to talk about any of this stuff because we're affected by our culture. And there's a lot of things that even 50 years ago people took for granted that today not many take for granted, or we can't take for granted. And so there's some fundamental principles that we need to get straight for any of the things I'm going to say to make any sense, okay? One is, and this might not seem like a novel thing, but it's hugely important, actions have meanings. Actions have meanings. Now, I don't mean like scratching my bald head. It doesn't have a real meaning to it. I just have an itch and I scratch it, right? But a handshake, a greeting, a hello, the sexual union between husband and wife in marriage, an embrace of friendship, a kiss, all these actions have meanings. And those meanings, oftentimes, in the most important of actions, right, are independent of our intentions, right? So, a punch to someone's face. It doesn't matter what I intend. That action has a meaning, and usually it's going to be a bad meaning, right? A kiss. It's always going to express something of affection. The sexual act between a husband and a wife, it's always going to have a meaning attached to it, regardless of the intentions. That's why it's such a bad thing to have sex outside of marriage, because you're saying something with your bodies. There is a meaning really there that you're really conveying that's completely separate from your intentions. It doesn't matter what you intend. The action itself speaks to a reality and has a meaning. So what is the meaning of the sexual act? Well, In faith, we as Christians, Catholics, hold that the sexual act needs always to be thought of in the context of love and ought to always express love. And even where that love is not present, where the two people are using each other, there's always this desire to have it be that way, right? Why is it so hard when two people are together and someone cheats on them? Because that action has a meaning, no matter what the intention was. It's not enough for the guy or the gal to say, well, it didn't mean anything to me, I'm moving on. No, that action has a real meaning. It's meant to be love. And for us as Christians, for us as Catholics, right, the one who shows us what real love is Jesus Christ himself. And so we can't think about any of this apart from the love of Christ, which is love that says, I'm going to love you, and in particular you, and I'm not going to decide not to love you in the future. I'm going to love you forever. And I'm going to give all of myself to you and for you. And when Christ gave himself in love, there was always a something more that came about, right? A new life, for example, in the resurrection, suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ on the cross. On the third day, he rose from the dead. That new life, new fruit comes from love in all its forms, even in the sexual act, or at least an openness to that, right? The third thing that's kind of difficult that we can't always presume is just that marriage should be exclusive, right? Now, hopefully none of you are struggling with that, but that's a real struggle in our society, right? To have a third person enter into that marriage, there's something wrong with that, right? And the final one is a basic fact of who we are as human beings. You and I are human persons. No one can have a right over us, right? No one has a right to me or to you. We call that slavery, right? We need to always think in those terms, though, when we're thinking about any kind of life, either at the end or at its beginnings. And so a child, no one has a right to a child. In fact, there are many people who don't deserve children. But a child always needs to be considered in the term, one word, big word, right? Gift. With those principles in mind, we can begin to speak about what we can do to help people who are having trouble conceiving. Now, infertility is generally defined as a year of trying to conceive without being able to, right? And hopefully that's using natural family planning, trying to, strategically to get in at the right time when the woman's body is able to receive a child, right? But that's how it's typically defined. And then, so what happens then is you go to the doctor and you try and figure out what's going on. Oftentimes, and maybe Dr. Lind will speak to some of this, there's a lot of things, especially with the woman's body, that can be overcome just by hormone therapy, removing of obstacles in the fallopian tubes or uterus or things like this, or just helping restore the proper functioning of the reproductive organs. But then comes the question of other technologies that are possible, and we call these ARTs in the business, artificial reproductive technologies, ARTs. And the church allows technology to be used to help folks who struggle with infertility, but they must always respect some of those things I mentioned, right? That actions have meanings apart from their intentions, that sex should be an expression of love, that marriage should be exclusive, and that children should be a gift, not a right. And therefore, any type of technology we use to help fertility needs to respect the dignity of the human person, not only of the husband and the wife coming together, but of that child or future child that may be. And that means that child should be inviolable, right? No one should ever take that child's life intentionally. 2, ARTs must respect the unity of marriage, right? You should only become a parent with your spouse, not from some outside person, right? Which is a real possibility nowadays, given, sperm donors, egg donors, surrogacy. Finally, ARTs should respect the specifically human values of sexuality, that the child should be the fruit of a real marital act, and the direct fruit, right? That when a husband and wife come together, the child should come from that, not from the actions of some other third party. And that the procreative and unitive meanings of the sexual act should be inseparable and together, right? That the real union and love exchange between them you can't have that real love unless you say, I'm going to love you and only you, and I want to give all of myself to you, and I want to receive all of you from you, right? And when that happens, there's always an openness to something more. And so to boil all that down into one fundamental principle about ARTs, the church has taught pretty definitively that medicine and technology may assist the procreative act, not replace it. And so illicit use of medical technology, ARTs, will always be those things that restore health, whether the man's reproductive system or the woman's reproductive system, by removing obstacles, using hormones or whatever to help with the proper functioning of the reproductive organs. The problem is when ARTs don't do that, right? They replace the sexual act or the procreative act rather than assist. And this happens in things like artificial insemination, in vitro fertilization, amongst a number of varieties and variations. Now this leads to a lot of problems. One is those ARTs that replace rather than assist treat the child not as a gift, but really as a product, right? Scientists are working on this child in a lab. And so the child is treated like many of the other things scientists use and work on in a lab. I don't want to use any crass examples, but the child's not a product. I'm not a product. You're not a product. We're human beings. We're persons. 2, there's a lot of problems with how the gametes, so the eggs and the sperm are collected. There can be a lot of problems there, and for a man, usually, they'll give him a magazine and send him into a room with a cup. That's not a good act of love. Third problem would be with IVF, in vitro fertilization, after the egg and the sperm are joined, usually in a petri dish in a lab, then what they'll do is implant those children in the woman's uterus, in the womb. And they'll oftentimes do multiple, just in case one doesn't take. But then when they implant multiple, the mom doesn't always want to have that many kids if both of them start developing in the uterus. Or the other ones kind of become a threat, right? So the viability is much better if you can only have one growing in there. And so what happens, the phrase is selective reduction, where the doctors will go in and take the life of one of the children implanted in the mother's womb. Another problem that happens with IVF is what happens to those embryos that are fertilized but not used. Oftentimes these clinics will put them in a freezer. And so children are being stored in freezers. There's also, of course, what happens to those children in the freezers then? And there's a great demand and call for them to be used for more further testing, scientific medical testing. Again, using a child as a product, as an object rather than a person, a gift. Finally, there's the trouble of expense, right? All these artificial reproductive technologies, super expensive, and oftentimes a great hardship on folks. Now, I can appreciate the real struggle and see my brother walk through it, the hardships that many folks who are struggling with fertility face. And I just tried to outline quickly some of the big problems. I have a handout for all of you who are here, and I can make it available to share with folks just so you can look at a little bit what I was talking about and remember what I was talking about. And And so I'm not trying to place a heavy burden on folks. But the consequences are great for who we are as human beings, for the future children of our world and how they are treated, for the dignity and unity of marriage, and really the integrity of the sexual act as a loving union between a husband and wife. So what are those who are struggling supposed to do? Well, this is what our experts here are here to help us with, right? The first thing I would tell you, though, is seek out a doctor who knows NFP well, who can help you with a lot of the troubles, especially with the woman's reproductive health. There's so many things that you can, a good doctor, and I would recommend an NFP-only doctor who really wants to help restore health with that area rather than an easy referral. But really seek to get that health restored. All the while, as a priest, right, stay rooted in your faith. Stay rooted in your prayer. Stay rooted in the sacraments. It's only with God that we can bear the struggles and challenges in this life. The only way I can do what I can do is with Jesus Christ, with the Eucharist, with my time in prayer. That's the only way I'm able to do what I can do. And that's the only way you and your marriages are going to be able to live love in any kind of way that does justice to the word love, right? Christ shows us what love is. We can only do it with his help. Finally, seek support from others. And that's what some of these other experts are going to share with you too, but don't walk in this alone. Now, you don't need to share it with everybody in the world. Not the person you get, in front of you in line and coffee, right? But get help from others and don't walk in this alone, whether it be a priest who you trust, a counselor, support groups, or even just a trusted friend or family member. But don't walk alone in your struggles, whether it be infertility or any struggle. We're called to be brothers and sisters of one another in Christ in the church, and we're here to support one another. So be open to that help. To recap, the fundamental principle: medicine and technology may assist the reproductive act, but not replace. And what's at stake is the dignity, really, of that future life, that child, the integrity of the sexual act, and ultimately who we are as human beings and what love really means. Thanks for your attention.
Wow, that's a hard presentation to follow. My name is Chris Hennelly, and I'm the Program Manager of Adoption Services at Catholic Charities in the Twin Cities. So I'm here today to talk about adoption. Generally, there's 3 different types of adoption. There's international adoption, which is pretty obvious, adopting children from another country. Usually they're at least 9 months of age. Then there's also the Minnesota waiting children, and these would be considered more involuntary adoptions, where children experienced some abuse and neglect, was removed from the home, and the parents' rights were terminated. So these children are ready to be adopted. Generally, they're older children, maybe at least 4 years to 12 years of age. So that's the Minnesota waiting children. At Catholic Charities, we do infant domestic adoptions. So it's voluntary adoptions. We work with expectant parents who are experiencing an unplanned pregnancy, and they're looking at their life and figuring out what's best for them. Maybe they have educational goals or career goals that they still are interested in pursuing, or maybe they don't have the financial support or the resources at this point in their lives to parent a child. And so they'll come to us and formulate an adoption plan. Today, well, back in the day, adoptions were all closed. So a birth parent would give birth, the baby was often removed to temporary care. Papers were signed, then the baby would go to an adoptive couple of the agency's choosing. So that's how they looked kind of back in the day. But today we do more open adoptions, where the expectant parent will see a bunch of profiles and meet a bunch of couples interested in adopting and have been have gone through the adoption process and the home study process and are ready to adopt a baby. So the open adoption is an expectant parent actually choosing a couple that they're interested in raising their child. Open adoption would be, like a fully open adoption would be full names, first and last names being exchanged, and people know where each other live, and there's contact, their visits, letters, pictures, etc. Then there's semi-open adoptions where maybe just the first names are exchanged, and maybe their locations are not shared at this point. Occasionally, we will do a confidential adoption where there's really little contact, if any contact or information shared. Sometimes that's due to religious reasons or cultural reasons, that they don't feel that other people can know. But that's pretty rare. So most of them really are semi and open adoptions. The criteria of adopting at Catholic Charities are that all couples have been married for 3 years. Most of them live within the Archdiocese, but we can work with other couples outside the Archdiocese. What else can I tell you? I think that's what I'll share right now, but if you have questions after, I'll be available to answer any questions that you have. Actually, I wanted to say one more thing, just thought of it. So another thing that's new with the web and the internet is that expectant parents now can actually just go online and find adoptive couples that way too. They don't have to come into the agency and look at profile books and go that way. We'll also see expectant parents finding couples that they want to raise their child via the internet. So we often we will work with or support adoptive couples who find their own birth parents that way too. We also do interstate adoptions and designated adoptions. So, okay, thank you.
I'm April Lind. I'm a physician both in internal medicine and pediatrics. I do actually a lot of talking on natural family planning, but this one is actually a little challenging for me. I'm very visually oriented, so I'm always putting up graphs and charts and getting people to understand from a visual perspective. And I was asked to talk about this in 15 minutes, and I feel like sometimes it could be a 3-hour lecture in and of itself. So I guess one of the big things I would say natural family planning is known in secular terms as fertility awareness-based methods of family planning, which basically just helps educate women and couples about their natural physiology. And knowledge is power, knowledge gains wisdom. And the one thing that constantly strikes me as a primary care physician is how little and how few women know much about how their body works, and how few couples really understand when am I fertile and what helps, what doesn't help. And so just learning those basics are so important, because I say of the couples that I help, a third of them I just have to educate them where the window is. And I facetiously say, tell them where and when to aim. And then that helps. Another third of couples, there's a lot of, fertility is a state of health. We are meant to be fruitful and multiply. The whole reason why we have hormonal birth control and all the various types of birth control is because our society has decided it's important to stop fertility, right? A natural, healthy process, so that we can use sex in other ways. But fertility is a state of health, and so if something is not working right, I think it behooves us to ask, what is not working? And currently, the state of infertility will be, you'll see your primary care doctor, you might get referred to your obstetrician, and if after a few investigations and trials of medication things aren't working, it's often, well, you need to go see the specialists, and the specialists aren't looking at always, they're offering other things other than sort of they're offering things that are expensive. I guess I should leave it that way. So I think the biggest thing is education about how your body works, because in that then you can identify where things aren't working and then try and understand why and hopefully try and fix that. And then that optimizes opportunities for conception. When I was thinking about, well, okay, if I can't sit here and give my graphs and pictures and presentations, I think what I would just say is, the unfortunate reality of having a diagnosis of infertility, which is defined as no conception within a year of trying with random acts of intercourse. Really, there's a lot of costs associated with it. There's the emotional cost, there's a physical cost, there's an economic cost, and there's a spiritual cost. And when I think of the emotional costs, I mean, it's the monthly disappointment every month when you're like, oh, this is going to be our month, and the month comes and the period comes, and it's one thing you learn to hate every month. And that's really a huge emotional toll, not only on the woman, but also on the man, which it's nice to have our next speaker too. And so, also that emotional cost of, is there something wrong with me as the woman? Is there something wrong with me as the man? What's going on? So there's just a lot of emotions surrounding the diagnosis of infertility, or when things aren't working or you feel like your body is failing you. So sometimes it's empowering to try and figure out how that works, and sometimes it's frightening because you don't want to figure out you're the one that might be the problem. So there's a lot of emotion around that. There's the physical cost, right? So there's a lot of things that we do to people. Medicine, while it's a healing art, can be kind of invasive. I recognize that. So the physical pain of blood draws or different lab tests or x-rays, and sometimes, although knowing you're created in the image and likeness of God, when somebody starts poking and prodding you a number of times, it's sort of easy to sort of lose that reality, if that makes sense. So there's a physical cost to determine the causes of infertility. And we live in a society that there are a lot of economic costs. Nothing is free. And the NFP community doesn't have a lot of resources necessarily. There's a lot of money in the reproductive industry. And when you look at medical studies published over the last 50 years, there's probably less than 400 studies on studying how a woman's body actually works, looking at natural family planning, studying her reproductive physiology, what natural things can we do to help improve that function. And there are 66 papers every month published on how can we make IVF more effective. So it's a challenge to find providers that will work with you within that framework of understanding your inherent dignity, the dignity of your marriage, and the dignity of any children that would come from that relationship. And that sort of gets to the spiritual questions. So it's easy when you're stuck in a challenge that you weren't planning on to say, why me? What have I done? Is there really a God? God is loving. I should be able to have children. So there can be a lot of spiritual questioning, and that's where I think it is important to sort of understand, why is the teaching of our faith so hard? Why does it seem so hard? Because it's impressive to me how commonplace IVF is, and how quickly somebody is able to say, well, they had a hard time conceiving, but we're so happy it happened through IVF now. And so what used to be taboo is now commonplace, and now you see it with surrogacy. So, our nightly, I'm never up this late, but the night show hosts, are talking about their surrogacies, and it's, and it really just starts to become commodity of infertility, instead of reflecting what the Catholic Church teaches, which is life and love should not be separated, and from life and from that unitive act of sexual intercourse and marriage, sometimes life comes from that, and then that child is a gift and knows that they are loved within the context of their mother and father's union. So I think those were the thoughts that I had about trying to touch on NFP in 15 minutes without getting into too much reproductive physiology. But if if the one thing would be that people could take away is that fertility is a state of health, that there's so much more to learn than what you might have gotten in your sex ed class or health class in 8th grade. There are a lot of resources on the internet where you can learn a little bit more about natural family planning. The best way is to take a course from one of the reputable providers, and there are many classes throughout the Twin Cities, because usually a lot of the fundamentals are given in those classes. And then when you're empowered with how your cycle is looking or working, it's being able to ask the questions, why? Because that's ultimately what medicine is. When something isn't working, the fundamental question is, why isn't it working? And is there a reason why I can figure it out? Sometimes the answer is no, we don't have the knowledge yet. But oftentimes there are a lot of things that can be done to try to support what is a natural process.
Well, good evening. My name again is Joe Pribble. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I work at an office in St. Paul called Quo Vadis Therapy Center. I also work out of a second location in Arden Hills, just north of St. Paul, at the Minnesota Renewal Center. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how men cope with and react to infertility as it may be different from women. I've got 10 minutes to cover all of that, and I might be able to do it in 5. We'll see. I want to first say that I don't want to make or give the impression that men are drastically different from women in all cases in the way that they experience or respond to infertility. But if I speak rather generally, I will kind of stay with some characteristics that we typically associate with men. And as it pertains to infertility, as with perhaps a number of things, a common complaint with men is we simply don't talk about how we're experiencing things, how we're processing things, how we're reacting to things that are happening in our lives. And I want to first address maybe some reasons as to why that might be. So first, I think, is that men often are not socialized to be very forthcoming and open about what's happening inside of them or what they're going through and how they're experiencing a given process. It's not that they're stubborn, though that can be true, but it is not something that a lot of men generally have great practice in doing. It's not often expected of them. They don't have many opportunities necessarily to gain that experience. Also, I think with men, there's a tendency to be focusing on how their wife is being affected through the process. Their role, as they may see it, or as they've perhaps learned it, is to be supportive and assisting to their wife, and that then takes them out of their own experience. And this isn't something perhaps of avoidance as much as it is, as a husband, this is my role and this is what I'm supposed to be doing. It's also interesting to me that what reinforces some of that is that a lot of resources that are out there, whether online or in books or wherever you might find information about infertility, a lot of it is not only written by women, but it's written for women. And when there is mention or discussion about how men are affected, it's rather minimal. I was doing a search online the other night and reviewing some of the books that are available to couples struggling with infertility or adoption loss or miscarriage. And there aren't very many reviews, first of all. There aren't a lot of people that are accessing these titles, apparently. And there was one book that I thought might be interesting in that it's written by a group of psychologists, including a male psychologist, but there was one chapter that was in the whole book, in the table of contents anyways, it was listed, and as I read it, dedicated to men. So there is this, as I say, this reinforcement, I think, within a lot of the places we can go for help and resources that focuses in on the women's experience, the woman's experience, the wife's experience. And that then guides perhaps a message of to the husband that this is something that you need to be aware of. More than what you're experiencing is what your wife is experiencing, and it is your job to take care of that. Interestingly enough, even as it might be a male factor issue with infertility. It's possible that men might even neglect their own health to concentrate on how their wife is being affected by their experience of infertility, which also may make the husband slower to get treatment that he might benefit from and that the couple might find helpful, and that then slows down the whole process of possibly finding a resolution, a hoped-for resolution to the infertility. And it also can, of course, frustrate the wife in these cases, too, when they don't feel that their husband is maybe taking on as much of a role as he might be able to do, taking on as much responsibility for his own health as may be helpful. There is also the fact that this is a medical issue, and of course, the stereotypes tend to show that men are generally reluctant to talk to doctors, to meet with doctors. And it goes with something so personal as infertility. It's already hard to talk about. It's hard then, on top of that, to then speak to a physician or some other provider that would be helpful about something that is so deeply personal. It's also, on top of that, a sexual issue. And I think, what I see in my practice is that there's not a lot of comfort around talking about sexuality for a lot of people. Whether it's parents talking to their children about sexuality, that's uncomfortable for everybody involved oftentimes. There is discomfort between couples in talking about sexuality, and that goes for couples who might not be struggling with infertility. There's a lot of unknowns, and I think a lot of it is just, again, it's the matter of comfort around such topics. It's difficult to talk about, and so we tend to avoid those things. Now, how are some ways that men might cope with infertility that might be a little bit different from women? I'm kind of alluding to some of them as I'm going on here, but men oftentimes will intellectualize situations, and certainly this can be true of infertility as well. So one thought that a man might have, a husband might have, is that God's will is not to grant us children, and I need to accept that, and maybe I do accept that. What that does, however, is detach or separate the husband from his own experience, from his emotional experience. It shuts down the processing that is going on there, and that can be unhealthy in a lot of different ways. I want to also clarify that what is it that we're dealing with as we're talking about this experience of infertility? If we call it by other names, we can call it such things as grief, as loss, and certainly even as trauma. And we can think of trauma in a clinical sense. It's that much of a wound for a lot of people. So it is something then that requires a process. If we're going to get through grief, we need to go through a process of working through that grief. Now, there's all kinds of methods and ideas and suggestions and advice that's out there and that you might have heard, of course, about how to go through a grief process, but it's a very individual process. It is one that doesn't have a strict timetable. It's one that each of us experience differently. We try to separate grief out into stages, and while we can identify certainly some aspects of a stage-wise view of grief, everybody might well experience it differently. So, for those who struggle with infertility, and certainly it's true of men and women, but looking more so at men right now, if that grief is not addressed, if it's not processed, we might delay that process for a period of time, but there are usually ways in which grief comes back to catch up with us. And if we're stuffing that or suppressing what we're feeling around that grief, it might well come out sideways. So that might look like anger. And if there's an emotion that men are given some leeway to express and to experience, anger is one of them. So far as it's not to excess and damaging in very visible ways, but anger is not helpful in this sense in a lot of ways either. One of those reasons being that it often gets in the way of a couple's relationship. So on top of the issue of around fertility and the difficulty that presents, a couple that's now angry at one another is not going to help their fertility either. So behind that anger is oftentimes a hurt. There needs to be some healing that happens because of that hurt. And the way to heal oftentimes is processing it, is going into that place, is expressing it. Better, I think, to express that and experience that with somebody else, with other people. If it's in a person's head, it stays internal and it can be distorted in a lot of ways. We also lose out on connection with other people, and certainly with one spouse, and that's where we want to strive to have connection. I'll say a little bit more about that in a few seconds here. I want to also mention that another way that men often cope with these types of things is to look for ways to fix it. So men can go about trying to find ways to fix the problem. And that might be one helpful way to look at it, but oftentimes men get in trouble here because what their wives might well be looking for is simply for them to listen, to hear, to validate, to be with them in that place and time, in that moment, in that emotion. Open up and be vulnerable with me. If we can do that and find one another as supportive, we will establish a better connection. This is much of the work that I do as a therapist with couples when they come in is trying to help them to open up and to be vulnerable with one another so that they can find that the other person is there for them. If this happens, this helps us through the grief. It helps us through healing, and it can do many things. It certainly can take away the anger that might be on top of the infertility, and if it reduces stress, and that's something that improves one's chances for conceiving, well, that's a great thing. In addition to that, it can also help couples to find together meaning in their experience and to develop a common vision for what their future might look like. If it should be with or without kids, it's still important that couples see themselves as a family and see themselves as having something to offer and having every bit the same right as anybody else to speak about and to express family life. So these are things that I think are very important. I think such things as support groups and therapists and other people are very necessary and helpful resources, but for the reasons that I've mentioned earlier, it can be difficult to get to those. It's difficult to access those for understandably difficult reasons. But the challenge is that how do we find together a way to live as a family, if that means it's done without children? And it is very much a gift to have a spouse. It is very much a gift that that we have a future, and we need to keep that in mind, and we need to lean on the people that are around us to offer us support through whatever trials we have. I hope I'm not taking too much away from you two. Okay. Well, I'm going to stop there so that I don't run into doing that. But thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Deacon Darrell Ian, and Chris and I were going to be talking a little bit about our experience and about our support group. When we were married back in '85, there was no internet. So when we started having the struggle with infertility, we had no place to go look for information. When we tried to talk to family, friends about it, they'd either give us a silent treatment, or they would say, well, get over it. You're lucky you can't have kids, or you got nieces and nephews. So in a way, we kind of felt isolated and we're on the journey by ourselves. So in '04, when I was ordained a deacon, I asked if my outreach ministry could be working with infertility couples. And at that point, we were sent over to the Family Life office, and we talked with Kathy Larrett, who was the director at the time. She told us about a group in his time that was meeting at the St. Joseph Hospital, the lady who started the group got pregnant, so she backed out. So we went over there, we got into the group. And after a while, the group kind of dispersed for whatever reason. So we took the group and brought it over to our parish. At the time, we were St. John's. And it's still over at our St. John's campus on the other end of Hopkins, off of Excelsior in Interlaken. And from then, it just went on. When I talked to couples about our support group, some of the responses were saying, well, we still want to have kids. We're either going medical or we want to adopt. We're not going to give up on kids yet. And I said, well, that's not the point of our group. Our support group is kind of a safe place for you to be, to talk to other couples who are on the same journey that understands the struggles you're going through. It's a place for support and fellowship. And we have couples come, and we also have individuals come for whatever reason. Maybe their spouse just doesn't feel like it's for them or busy or whatever, so you don't have to feel like you have to drag your spouse to the support group. What we do in our support group, we'll start with prayer, and then we get a chance, we go around and have everybody kind of check in. If they have a struggle they want to talk about or something unusual happened due with the infertility, we talk about that. And then what we mainly do is we read a book, or we have a book that we read a chapter. We agree on the topic that we want to read, and then that leads our discussion. And a lot of time the Holy Spirit leads us in other directions. And it's usually what needs to be talked about at that night. And for us, even though we've been on a struggle or a journey for 29 years, it's still kind of a healing process for us, and the group's been helpful for us. For us, we've gone through different stages. We're looking back now, in a way we find it's a blessing, our infertility, because it brought us closer together. We increased our communication and also got us deeper in our faith. When we didn't have any support from other people, we went towards our faith. Chris became friends with St. Jude. He's a helpless cause. I always ask her, is it because of the infertility or because of me? And that's the response I get. And I turned to the Blessed Mother too, and that was a big help too. And that's what we try to bring into the group too, is bring the faith into the struggle, and that's quite helpful.
Hi, I'm Chris. It was a very lonely struggle in the beginning. We had no family, friend support. Anytime we wanted to talk about it, they just shut down. Everybody just changed the subject. We had no resources. Like Daryl said, there was no computer, there was no internet, nothing. So it was very lonely out there at that time, and this is our heart's desire, to help other couples go through what we went through. And we still are struggling to this day, but it's better. It'll be almost 30 years, well, it'll be 30 years, the beginning of next year, but we've known shortly after we were married, it was Daryl had problems when he was younger, and so there was a possibility he would be sterile. And so when we went into the marriage, we both knew that, but we didn't know until we got married what was going to happen. And we hoped to God that it wouldn't be true, but it ended up to be true. So we just kept going. We did one Lent, we started praying the rosary together, and that really helped us grow closer together spiritually. I have to say that this group has really helped a lot for us in the healing process. But thank you.
So we're going to alternate as we're talking between the two of us. We were really hesitant about speaking tonight, but we realized that it could be of benefit to someone struggling with infertility to hear about our experience and how we are coping with our infertility. In preparing for tonight, I thought about what I would have wanted someone to say to me at the beginning of my infertility journey. I think the answer is that God's plan for your life is a positive one, and He loves you whether you become parents or not. I know this might sound pretty basic, but But when your life is turned upside down with infertility, what was once a solid foundation starts to erode. So I must stress again that God loves you. He is not preventing pregnancy to punish you. So let us explain a little bit about our journey and how we came to realize this truth.
Our infertility journey began in 2003. At first, I was confident that we would eventually get pregnant since we had the same plan and expectations as most other people, and I'm sure most of you, get married, buy a house, have children. However, Susan started to experience pain, and it was determined that she had medical issues affecting her reproductive organs. The next year or so was very difficult as I watched Susan struggle with pain that alternated from dull to severe as she was plagued with recurring medical issues. Our hopes for conceiving started to fade as we faced each of these setbacks.
During this time, God was already nudging us towards some things that would really help us in profound ways. After seeing many doctors about my medical issues, I finally was able to connect with a doctor that really helped me manage my symptoms. And I went from being in constant pain to being virtually pain-free. The second thing that happened was that we met a nurse through NFP, and she lent us a book that was a huge turning point. I realized that I was slowly letting my lack of fertility take over my life, and I had found it difficult to trust in God's plan for us. And lastly, my mom heard an ad on Relevant Radio about an infertility support group called In His Time. It was such a blessing to have that moment to share experiences with other people that understood the heartaches of infertility.
So at that time, we decided to move forward with domestic adoption, and eventually we were matched with a pregnant birth mother to adopt her soon-to-be-born child. Our hopes were very high. We were thrilled, excited, nervous, everything at the same time. After the child was born, we had the chance to experience firsthand the complete vulnerability, dependency, trust of that little child that you're holding. However, 3 weeks after birth, we had a reclaim. The birth father contested the adoption plan, which meant we had to return the child. Obviously, this was heartbreaking, but we now had a tangible thing to grieve. Somehow, this devastating event triggered a significant step forward in our healing process. We eventually decided not to pursue another adoption. We felt God nudging us in a different direction.
God's plan for us was and is a positive one. It took us a long time to accept that His will and wish for us didn't involve being parents. During the grieving process, we moved through denial, anger, frustration, and finally acceptance. Our emotions of intense despair have faded to only occasional pangs when we think about how we won't have the joy of graduations, weddings, and grandchildren. Today, we are active in our church. Jeff is on the pastoral council and in music, and I am on the finance council, on the Fall Festival committee, and I'm also a Befriender leader. And we also regularly attend In His Time, and we believe that our marriage is stronger than it was 10 years ago because of all the things that we've experienced together. I think God blesses us with the will and grace to choose how to think of ourselves. I choose to think of myself as a wife, sister, daughter, aunt, godmother, friend, and Catholic. I choose not to dwell on the barren parts of my body because my life is not barren.
So we wanted to give you some strategies for coping if you are experiencing infertility. First, a warning of the things people will say that could be difficult to hear. One is just relax. This was the number one thing said to Susan. For her, it implied that her actions were causing the issue, and she was actually relieved on some level when we learned that she had a medical issue preventing pregnancy. Another one was just adopt and you'll get pregnant on your own. That one was pretty offensive. Adopting, is a way to bring a child into your family, but it's not meant to be an almost son or an almost daughter or a replacement. And also, statistics don't support that either. It's really just a myth. Don't think about it so much. There are constant reminders everywhere of infertility. Pregnant women, babies, exuberant children everywhere in stores, restaurants, church, and in the neighborhood. Sometimes just meeting people, they would say, "Do you have a family?" Well, yes. Usually what they're asking is if you have children, but it also implies that your family of two isn't really a family. So here's some tips you can try. As a guy, if there is a baby shower that your wife wants to attend to show support for a close friend, it's a good idea to plan on having a fun activity together afterwards so she doesn't have time to dwell on how uncomfortable she felt during the event. Also, give yourself permission to just say no. If someone invites you to something and you don't want to attend, just don't go. A polite decline with a nice card in the mail can suffice. You can look for activities that you can do together that give back to the community. That's helped us a lot. And it helps you remember that your life can be fruitful and helps keep you balanced. And just make it a priority to spend time together as a couple.
Just a few more tips. Pray. This is hard because God can feel so very far away when you're coming to grips with infertility. Speaking from experience, I was very angry. It wasn't until I was honest with Him in prayer about how angry I was that I started to find peace. Talk to people about your infertility. I know how vulnerable this makes you feel, but it can become very isolating if you hold everything in. Your spouse wants to support you, but sometimes there's benefit in sharing that with somebody else. The In His Time group is a great resource for that. Try reading some books about infertility and spirituality. I actually have a couple with me if you want to look at them afterwards that have really helped us. This is a slight confession, but if you're in a group setting and the conversation is making you uncomfortable, it's okay to pretend to have to go to the bathroom. And it's also, the bathroom is a sanctuary for you to gather your emotions if things are getting a little raw and coming to the surface. It's just a moment for you to collect yourself and then return to the group, and maybe by the time you get back, they have moved on to a different topic. People are going to say things that hurt without intending to. So you need to remind yourself that their comments are probably not intended to hurt you. So again, remember that God loves you, and there are many ways that you can be fruitful with your life.